Welcome, colleagues, students, and guests to this afternoon's event. For those at the back, we can also occupy the aisle so that we'd get comfortable for the talk. To formally open our program, may I call on the Dean of the College of Social Sciences, Dean Toto Colongon.
Good morning, everyone. I welcome you to this lecture on philosophy of history. These back-to-back lectures are the first in a series of lectures that the college is organizing for you, students, and hopefully the general public of Baguio City. I welcome our distinguished speaker, Professor Eric Nelson, who will be properly introduced later, right? Thank you for finding the time to share with us your knowledge and expertise. Dr. Nelson, your main audience today in the house are undergraduate students, distinguished as the first batch of the K+12 generation in the revised education curriculum in the Philippines. These are young people who are eager to learn, and I hope that they will take advantage to learn as much as they can from your two lectures, one today and one tomorrow. The lecture series of the College of Social Sciences for this calendar year has been conceptualized as a platform for generally two types of speakers: a platform for our own scholars in the college, faculty from the 3 departments and the institute who have recently completed their original researches, either as part of their continuing research or as part of their master's thesis or doctoral dissertations. The other type includes scholars and experts from outside this university, local or abroad, who are invited by the faculty of the college, from whom we could learn and expand our horizons as we try to explore the contours of our specific disciplines. This is the category where our speaker today falls. And before I end, I'd like to acknowledge the presence of our Chancellor, Chancellor Rovilius, and the discipline of history and philosophy, full force. Congratulations and thank you for being here. So I would like to actually end by thanking the whole department, specifically the faculty of the discipline of philosophy, and more specifically, Professor Kelly Agra, for her determination to make this happen. Okay. Thank you, and I think we're ready to listen to the lecture after the proper introduction. Thank you very much, and let's listen and enjoy the lecture today.
Thank you, Dean Toto. Now to introduce our speaker for today. He is currently an Associate Professor of Humanities at the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. His expertise includes Chinese, German, and Jewish philosophy. He has written a number of works. He is the author of Chinese and Buddhist Philosophy in Early 20th Century German Thought, Levinas, Adorno, and the Ethics of the Material Order. And he has also co-edited the Bloomsbury Companion to Heidegger, Rethinking Facticity, Between Levinas and Heidegger, and Addressing Levinas, and one other German work on Dilthey, which I'm afraid I won't attempt to read for fear of mispronouncing every word. He has published over 70 articles and is the editor of Interpreting Dilthey, Critical Essays. Furthermore, he has also edited a special topic issues of Frontiers of Philosophy in China and the Journal of Chinese Philosophy. Prolific as he is in philosophizing, he also does hiking for a hobby. Ladies and gentlemen, we're very pleased to have with us today for his talk on Dilthey and the Historical School. Please welcome with us from the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology, Professor Eric Nelson.
And then I do this. So thank you for the invitation to be here. I'm very happy to be visiting in the Philippines. Hong Kong is not very far away. It's only 2 hours by flight from Manila. And I'll be presenting two different talks today and tomorrow. And today's talk will be focused on a certain set of episodes in 19th century philosophy of history that are actually very formative for the discipline of history in a variety of ways, but also philosophy as well. Then tomorrow we'll look at a set of thinkers in the 20th century, so you're also welcome to attend that talk as well. I also want to mention that this book, Interpreting Dilthey, is an edited collection of essays. It'll be appearing next month, so maybe you can find it online or read it elsewhere in the library. It's an introduction to Dilthey's work, not only his philosophy of history, but also the human sciences, psychology, ethics, anthropology and biology, and so on and so forth. Because Dilthey is a very interesting philosopher because he believed in the close interconnection between philosophy and the sciences. But on the other hand, he's not a positivistic scientific thinker. He doesn't believe in the reduction of all of the sciences, all of philosophy, to the natural sciences. And so what Dilthey is most famous for probably is this notion of the human sciences, the Geisteswissenschaften. And this is a notion he developed in the late 19th century in response to a certain form of historical thinking that we will discuss today. So first I want to introduce a little bit about Dilthey. Obviously he was German, but it's also interesting that he was from the Rhine region, outside of the area of Prussia, and the Rhine region was characterized more by a certain spirit of liberalism. And so one element of Dilthey's thinking is that it's fairly humanistic and liberal compared to many other German thinkers of the 19th century, but also notoriously of the 20th century in the early part. But he spent most of his time at the University of Berlin as a professor, where he was professor for the last 30 years of his life. Then he died in a small little town in what was then Austria, but is now northern Italy, in the middle of the Italian Alps. So it's a very nice location. I also wanted to show you a picture of his birth house. So if you're ever in Wiesbaden-Bierbrich, you can visit the Dilthey house. Unfortunately, there's no museum there, but they do have a restaurant, so you can drink beer or have a piece of cake where Dilthey was born. So it's right outside of Wiesbaden. It's a section of Wiesbaden now. So Dilthey was a philosopher first and foremost, but he was also a historian. And he made a deep impact in both areas. And the kind of philosophy he was doing was deeply connected with his historical enterprise. So for example, as a philosopher, he wanted to make philosophy historical. That is, bring in this historical dimension that the philosophers previously had neglected. But also at the same time, as a historian, he wanted to make history philosophical, to show the philosophical impact and significance of historical movements and actions and agents and so on and so forth. So in this sense, he's a very productive thinker in bringing together these two disciplines that, of course, are brought together here as well in your program of philosophy and history. So in a sense, this is a good talk for bring philosophy and history together. So as a practicing historian, his major works on history were about the history of the human sciences themselves. So for example, he developed an account of how the human sciences developed, but he also did the history of historiography, the history of the cultural sciences. So he is sort of what we call now an intellectual historian. But it wasn't simply intellectual history that he was concerned with, but broader cultural movements. And so he also wrote about music and art and poetry in relationship to the popular culture of their own time at various periods, especially in German history. So Dilthey's notion of history was primarily formed in relationship to one of the great movements in history in the 19th century. And this is the so-called historical school, the Historische Schule. And these figures really created history as a discipline, as an academic discipline. So North American history and history throughout the world has been deeply shaped by the German historians who made history into what they wanted to see as a science. And so this whole project of history as a science was formulated in the early and mid-19th century. And this is what Dilthey is responding to as a philosopher and a historian. So he was trained at the University of Berlin, what is now Humboldt University in the center of Berlin. And he worked in philosophy primarily with an neo-Aristotelian thinker named Trelleborg, who's also the teacher of Brentano, who's the teacher of Husserl. So that goes into phenomenology, and that's why there's a historical connection between Dilthey's thinking and phenomenology. But also he trained with these great historians, right? Some of the history scholars among you might know some of them, but of these, probably the most famous are Jakob Grimm, right? Who's very famous for the history of fairy tales and gathering together all the German fairy tales together. The story of Red Riding Hood and the wolf and so on. All of these great Germanic stories were gathered by the Grimm brothers, but also Mommsen and Ranke, who we'll talk about in a little bit more detail today. So all of these figures are associated with this movement called the historical school. And it's interesting that Dilthey throughout his life, even though in some ways he's partially a critic of the historical school, always refers back to that. Even when he's very old in 1903, he praises the influence of the historical school on this science of history, the study of history, but also of the human sciences, and also his own philosophical project. Oops. Thank you. Sorry. So Dilthey published his first great work. It's called The Introduction to the Human Sciences. And this is actually the original German cover to the book. So Einleitung is just introduction. Geisteswissenschaften is human sciences. And it's published in 1883. And in this work that is really representative of his early work, although it's the middle of his life when he published it, he's trying to develop a notion of the autonomy, that is the independence of the human sciences. How each human science, such as history, psychology, anthropology, has its own object and its own objects of concern and its own methodologies as well. And he wants to ground this in a kind of philosophical epistemology, a theory of knowledge that he calls a critique of historical reason. And we'll return to that notion a few times in the talk today. At the same time as he presents his work as a defense and justification of the historical school, he also wants to critique the historical school and go beyond the limitations of his teachers. And this he does in confrontation with English and French positivism and empiricism. So in the Introduction to the Human Sciences, Dilthey spends a lot of time discussing John Stuart Mill, Auguste Comte, all of the great empiricist, positivistic thinkers of the English and French traditions of that time. And indeed, he says he wants to position his own philosophy of the human sciences between the historicism of the historical school on the one hand and the positivism of the English and French thinkers on the other hand. So in that sense, he's justifying the historical school, but also at the same time going beyond it by exposing it to these other philosophical traditions and trying to create a new system of the human sciences, a new philosophy for the human sciences. So there's a lot of controversy about what the overall project of the Introduction to the Human Sciences actually is because of this. So various scholars have argued that basically he's a defender of historicism, the historicism of the historical school. He might have a more liberalized form of it, but he's still totally in tune with what they were thinking. So that's one line of interpretation. The other is that he's trying to mediate between the two, and that's what he explicitly states he's trying to do. Dilthey wants to mediate between these two different dominant tendencies of 19th century Western philosophy and social scientific thinking. But because of that, he's often accused of being a crypto-positivist. So later on, Heidegger, Gadamer, all accused Dilthey of being too scientistic, too positivistic. And the reason for this is because he's too accommodating, according to Heidegger and Gadamer, to the positivistic position of Comte, Mill, and so on and so forth. So you can just see by being in the middle, he can be attacked on both sides, right? So that's kind of the fate of being in the middle. So there's a disputed question then about which three of these interpretations would be the best one. And I'm going to give you an account of which one I think is the best one today by going through his approach to the historical school, but also the philosophy he develops through his confrontation with the historical school. So I just want to show you this one quotation at the very beginning where he indicates the project, right, that he has, But he seems to state two different things that may or may not be consistent with one another. So some people argue that the first claim is inconsistent with the second one, right? One is he wants to make the historical school philosophical. So he seems to be justifying the program and project of the historical school of historicism. The second one is that he wants to resolve the conflict between the historical school and what he calls the abstract positivistic theories of Comte and Mill. So you can see how there's a tension then in those two goals that he has. One is simply a philosophical elaboration, deepening of historicism. The other is actually a mediation between historicism and its positivistic critics. So which interpretation should we choose? Well, I'll tell you by the end of today, hopefully, which one is better. So what does this critique of historical reason mean? Well, obviously, this is taking place in the context of Kantianism, right? So one of the major philosophers that Dilthey is referring back to is Kant's critique of pure reason, and the other critiques as well. And so we might say that what he's developing, what Dilthey is developing here, is a critique of historical judgment. And this is very much in line with Kant's project, because when Kant talks about theoretical reason, practical reason, aesthetic judgment, it's always about the nature of judgment. What kind of judgments do we make when we think about the sciences? What kind of judgments do we make when we think about morality and ethical dilemmas about whether we should lie or not in a given situation? So for Kant, a critique of reason is actually a critique of judgment, our ability to reason in relationship to different matters of fact or different values or different norms. And so Dilthey's critique of historical reason is also a critique of historical judgment. And he makes this very clear as well, that one of the primary goals of the Introduction to the Human Sciences, this great work of 1883, is precisely to provide a solid basis for the judgments, the form of thinking, right, of evaluation, of assessment that we find in the historian, the political economist, the jurist, and so on and so forth. So notice that he's not only concerned with the academic judgments of academic historians, he's also concerned with the practical judgments of jurists, right? And political economists, not simply as they theorize about political economy, but also as they guide the economy by giving advice to the government, for example. So remember, this is the age of positivism, and Mill and Comte are very much trying to produce a social science that will guide political activities. So the idea of positivism in the 19th century, as opposed to the 20th century, this is a very important difference, is that it has a practical motivation. So for Comte, Mill, in 19th century positivism, the goal of science is to guide governments, governing society with social planning, social engineering to a certain extent, and so on. Whereas the positivism of the 20th century is more or less concerned with theoretical science, right? So there is a difference between these stages of positivism. And Dilthey, in that sense, is closer to the 19th century sense of positivism, because he, even though he's a critic of the positivist program, he too sees the role of the sciences, of the human sciences, as having a function in bettering society. So it has a social political function at the same time that it has a scientific one. And this comes out clearly here, right? So the philosophy of the human sciences is not only of an academic interest, it's also of a real social political interest as well. So let's turn now to the relationship between Dilthey and this very crucial historian of the early 19th century, the first half of the 19th century, Ranke. So Ranke is pretty much credited with creating history as a discipline. So history emerged in 19th century German university system as an academic discipline. There was history before, of course, but it wasn't really an academic discipline as such. And that's what the German universities created through figures like Ranke. And Ranke was a leading figure of this period. And he developed what is now called this position of the historical school, and sometimes it's called more theoretically historicism. And what is this historicism? Well, basically historicism means that you can only understand something, a phenomenon, through its historical development and the context of its development. So you need to know the history of a phenomenon to know what that phenomenon is. That's the basic, simplest way of saying what historicism is. And it also involves another set of factors, right, in its 19th century form. So it's also very anti-theoretical. The 19th century historicists were against theorizing about history. They simply wanted to describe history as it was. So they opposed both the speculative philosophy of history of figures like Hegel. They thought Hegel was running riot through history, inventing all these crazy concepts, right? And they were also against the positivists who were trying to theorize the laws of history. So they were against any project of proposing basic laws of historical life. Historical life was always too rich, too complicated, too mediated to understand it through any basic principle, whether it be from the speculation of the philosophers or the theorems of the positivistic social sciences. So history then, what is it about? Well, for Ranke, it's about studying the actual historical particularities, immersing yourself in the particular and not breaking from it. So he wants to describe history as it actually was. That's his famous phrase, right? So you simply immerse yourself in primary sources, all of the sources that are available, no matter how obscure. So Ranke developed this technique of going to the archives, the medieval archives throughout Europe, and not just reading like the famous books about history, right, written by people hundreds of years later, but looking at the first-hand sources of the laws, the diplomatic reports, the economic activities of various people, and so on and so forth. Because Ranke believed that you could understand history only by looking at all the minutiae of history, right? And so he really invented the modern idea of history by doing that. Because historians focus not just on the great figures of history now, they also focus on looking at microhistories, what Foucault calls microhistory. And Ranke was a pioneer of this idea of history as microhistory. But likewise, he wanted to focus on historical personalities. So he also focused on the great figures as well, but in the context of their own lives, of their own situations. And each of these for him was something utterly unique, and so you could not have a general law to compare, say, Caesar and Napoleon. You had to describe them in their historical detail, their historical facticity, particularity as they are. So that's what Ranke's project was. And this was deeply influential, not just in Germany, but for the entire opening up of the field of history, also in the United States, for example. In the United States, they were very influenced by the development of German academia in the 19th century. So Harvard and other American universities based themselves on the German model in the 19th century. So let's go into a little bit more detail about what Ranke is trying to do as a historian. I have some famous quotes from him about how he describes history, the discipline of history. So the basic idea is to describe history as it actually was. And this means you have to understand history as distinct from the present. So you might know, some of you, Foucault has a critique of what he calls presentism, but actually Ranke has a critique of presentism already in the early 19th century, right? That you just kind of evaluate a past epoch according to the mores, the norms, the customs of the current times, right? So you have to understand the past as it's distinctive from the present. What is different about that historical period that's not just the same as we are. So there might be similarities of human nature or psychology, but there are also differences of political circumstances, of culture, and so on and so forth. And this is why he states in his diaries in 1814, so very early in his project, but it's not for the past as a part of the present, but for the past as that man is properly concerned. So he has this notion of past as radically distinct from the present. Likewise, he's concerned with the contingent, conditional facts of history, all of the minutiae of microhistory, and that comes out in the second quote, right? That the strict presentation of the facts, no matter how conditional and unattractive they might be, is undoubtedly the supreme law of historical research. So you have to be not just looking at what seems most famous or noteworthy, but look at all of the minutiae to understand a historical period or historical figure. So to understand Napoleon, you have to look not just at what Napoleon says about himself or what the generals say, you have to look at what his valet is saying, right? And so on. So all of the particularities, right, all of the minutiae that make up this person's life have to be brought into consideration. And what this means then is that history has to be seen in terms of the past having its own reality. And so this is probably the most famous quotation from Ranke. They recite it all the time in Introduction to History or Philosophy of History books, that history seeks to show the past as it really was, right? So that's the goal of history according to the historical school. To immerse yourself in all the particularities, to disclose the past as it is in itself, not simply as we want it to be or wish it to be. So in that sense, he's trying to develop a kind of objective history, even though that notion of objectivity is rooted in particularity, uniqueness, contingent facts, and so on. So let's go a little bit further into Ranke's account of history, because he's also introduces this notion of using empirical sources of all kinds. This is what really made Ranke famous as a historian, in contrast to the historians of the past. So basically, he wants you not to look at the reports of later historians about a historical epoch, but rather go back into that historical epoch itself and find all the ruins, the traces, the texts, whatever is available to you to interpret that historical period. And so what he wants is eyewitness accounts, right? Because they offer the most genuine, most immediate sources of that historical period. And there's a kind of philosophical dimension to this project then, of how he's doing history. And this is this concern about the particular. So remember, he's very opposed to Hegelian type of conceptualizing of history, but also positivistic abstractions about history. So he wants us to always begin with the particular and then move from the general from that particular. So it's a sort of inductive method that he's proposing. And another side of this emphasis on particularity is very interesting. There's also another well-known quote from Ranke that he gets from Herder, is that every epoch is immediate to God, right? So each one has its own validity, its own legitimacy. So often we want to evaluate past peoples according to our present mores, right? So people evaluate, say, people in ancient Rome or ancient China according to the standards of our own time. But for Ranke, that's totally inappropriate because they're immediate to God as much as we are. That means, not theologically speaking, they're immediate to God, but rather in terms of their validity of their own viewpoint, of their own perspective. And so what he's stating is that each epoch has its own center of autonomy, its own characteristics, its own feature. And he's introducing here a very important notion for 20th century continental philosophy, as well as history, which is the notion of historicity. And we're going to see later in this talk how Dilthey transforms this notion of historicity here. He's going to reinterpret it. And this reinterpretation of historicity in Ranke becomes very important for the later hermeneutical tradition of Heidegger and Gadamer, Ricoeur, and so on. So as I mentioned, Ranke was the most important historian for Dilthey, and the historical school, the most important historical methodology for Dilthey. And he mentions this a number of times, even when he's quite elderly, right, reminiscing about his youth in 1903. He talks about how Ranke is this great figure, right, for all the students of his era, studying in Berlin in the 1850s and 1860s. And it's very interesting how he describes him, that he knew everything, right? Even though he's a critic of Hegel, Ranke knew Hegel, right? So it's not that he's just biased against this figure. He studies these things before rejecting them. So he's well-learned, but also he assimilates all of these different sources, right? He reads all of these chronicles of Italian politicians, ambassadors, historians, and so on and so forth, right? So this amazed the students that one person could read all these different historical sources in all these different languages, right? Latin, Italian, and so on. And basically the insight that Dilthey had into his method as a historian, right, was that he transformed everything into the power of objectively intuiting what has been. So Ranke would gather all these variety of sources and then have a kind of intuition of what that epoch was like. And that's what his power was as a historian. And many people still consider him one of the great writers of history because he could really vividly present what a historical epoch was like as distinct from the present. So when he wrote about the Italian Renaissance, people felt, wow, this is the Italian Renaissance, right? It's amazing. And so for them, he was the embodiment of historical insight as such, right? That's pretty amazing. That's impressive. So what is then the methodology that Ranke is relying on, according to Dilthey? And this will get us into the more theoretical project that Dilthey is undertaking. So Ranke, for Dilthey, is an artist of historical life. He's akin to a poet, basically, gathering all of these different intuitions and insights and materials and presenting them as a whole to the reader. So that's a very powerful way for history to proceed, right? It's an important aspect of history, but Dilthey is also going to be critical of understanding this as the whole of history. So he repeatedly emphasizes the greatness of Ranke as an artist of history, right? He's a great artist. History is an art for him. But likewise, he presents each historical period as having its own center, requiring no other. This is the notion of the autonomy of each historical era in terms of its own self-understanding or self-presentation. Likewise, he believes in this idea of self-erasure to get to history as it was. But here we begin to see why Dilthey also has a critique of Ranke and the historical school as well, because he doesn't think that a historian, right, even though they long for this objective reality of the past as it was, could ever truly be in the past as it was. So for Ranke, there's a kind of self-erasure, right, to enter into historical objectivity as it actually occurred. But as we're going to see, Dilthey has a critique of this whole conception of history, even though he thinks it's very important for the discipline of history. So before we turn to Dilthey's critique of Ranke, we'll just summarize the strength of Ranke for Dilthey with the following statement. So Ranke, his significance is this, that the foundation of all historical knowledge and its highest goal is the narrative presentation of the singular nexus of history. So you have history as art, as narrative. So that's very compelling to a popular audience when they read that, right? And it's presenting the kind of singular nexus of historical events, of great and minor figures and cultures and so on and so forth. So that's the strength of it. But at the same time, this shows the weakness of Ranke and the historical school as well. And that's what we'll turn to now. We'll consider the limits of this project and why Dilthey thinks we have to move further than the historicism of this so-called historical school. So what are Ranke's limitations? Well, Dilthey discusses a number of them, so we'll try to summarize them in this slide here. So first off, Ranke is committing what Dilthey calls narrative abandon, right? He just wildly runs through narrative, and there seems to be a kind of compellingness to this narrative. It's very artistic, it's very poetic, right? But then the question is that all history is? Is a kind of artistic, poetic presentation of the singularities of the past as distinct from the present. And so Dilthey says, well, this is actually presupposing a philosophy of history, which of course Ranke rejects the possibility of. But even though he rejects the possibility of a philosophy of history, he has his own conception of history that he's relying on in presenting these narratives of particular facts. So the first problem that Dilthey has is that Ranke is hiding his conceptual context, his conceptual sources and resources that he's relying on. So one of the major problems for Dilthey is that Ranke and the historical school seems to have a distrust of theory, but this leads to a distrust of concepts and conceptual thinking, which actually distorts their own project. Because history is not simply art, it also involves conceptualization, the use of concepts to think about different historical periods. And even when it denies the role of concepts, it's still relying upon them. So there's a kind of contradiction in the historical school's project then, according to the first criticism. The second one follows from this, right? That Ranke and the historical school simply wants to portray history as it was, in and of itself, right? Without any evaluation or assessment on their own part. They want to be neutral, impartial, objective observers. But can we ever be a purely neutral, objective observer of the past, as it simply was? So this is Dilthey's second problem, right, is that there's a lack of critical analysis of the historical situations that one is considering. So when one describes the Italian Renaissance, how can you do so without making evaluations, assessments, without analyzing the various dimensions, right, of that historical period? So there has to be this analytic component of history as well as the narrative dimension of history. History is not only narrative, it's also analysis. Third, and this is kind of the hermeneutical transformation of the notion of historicity that I indicated earlier, Ranke does not recognize his own interpretive positionality in relationship to the past. So of course we should criticize presentism as the naive projection of the present onto the past. But at the same time, we can't simply bracket or exclude the role that the present has in interpreting the past. So when we interpret the past, we're doing so in our present situation with current and contemporary concerns that might not have been in that historical period. So we have our own interpretive, hermeneutical situation. So this notion is actually very important for the development of hermeneutics, because this idea becomes what Heidegger, for example, in his early writings calls the hermeneutical situation. That you're always within an interpretive context, even when you're trying to relate to other interpretive contexts. That you can't bracket or get rid of your own hermeneutic or interpretive positionality. And this is kind of the hermeneutical turn that Dilthey is introducing to both the notion of history and of the human sciences as well. So it's impossible, right, to be completely neutral, completely objective, simply surveying the past as it was by erasing oneself. So this means then that Dilthey's project has to go beyond the historical school, beyond historicism. And that's what we'll turn to next. So let's consider his assessment then of the historical school, both its achievements, what it does that is necessary to maintain in the discipline of history and in the human sciences as a whole, and then turn to his criticisms of the limitations of the historical school. So the historical school has a number of strengths, right, in that it emphasizes the particularities and unique features of historical reality. That's everything a historian should do, right? They should recognize what is unique about any historical subject matter. At the same time, they have a universal sense of each particularity in its own context of its own conditions. This is the autonomy of the object that one is considering. And finally, there's what we might call historicity. And basically, I get these three ideas from this quotation, right, from Dilthey. So keep those in mind. So Dilthey's early formulation in the Introduction to the Human Sciences in 1883 of what is to be learned and adopted from the historical school can be summarized as following. First, there's a principle of historical immanence, of historical autonomy. That history is immanent to itself. Each epoch has its own autonomy in how we should evaluate and assess it. This is the knowledge of the principles of the human world falls within the world itself, that world itself. Secondly, there's the principle of what we might call singularity, that each historical epoch and figure, right, is distinctive and singular to one degree or another. It all has its individual facts and details and characteristics that always have to be brought into consideration. So two aspects of the task of the historian then is to attend to the autonomy of historical periods and the singularity of historical periods and figures and actions and so on. But on the other hand, this is not enough for a discipline of history. History can simply be the narrative or intuitive presentation of particularities and historical epochs. So history needs to be expanded from this historicist idea. It has to have a conceptual analytic dimension as well. At least this is Dilthey's argument in this work. So basically he's going to argue that the historical school, right, has not yet succeeded in breaking through their inner limits, which inhibited their theoretical development. So again, the concern here, as with the critique of Ranke, is that the historical school overly limits the conceptual side of history. So history is concerned with the singular, the emotive, right, the narrative and so on. But it's also concerned with the analysis of historical events and structures as well. And so what Dilthey is going to argue is that there has to be a deeper philosophical grounding of history on the one hand, but there also has to be a relation between history and the other human sciences. So this is where he's going to introduce the notion of structure, that history is not just a narrative of events and persons, it's an analysis of the structures that are displayed or exhibited in any given historical period. So of course, Dilthey is very famous for being a hermeneutical thinker, but what is often forgotten is that he's also a structural thinker at the same time. He uses a mode of structural, functional explanation, as we're going to see in the rest of the talk today. So basically then, what is lacking in the historical school is it lacks philosophy, right? It lacks an adequate epistemology, self-reflection, the use of concepts, and a relationship to the other human sciences, right? But does history actually need philosophy? That's a good question to ask here, right? So what is the relationship between history and philosophy then? Well, Dilthey's project here is to not just describe history as an isolated discipline, but to situate it within the context of the human sciences. So for him, history has to be understood as a human science in relationship to other human sciences, from anthropology and psychology to political economy, and so on. And so this is where Dilthey is going to introduce kind of his unique twist in this situation, his unique interpretation, that what is needed is a philosophy of the human sciences to comprehend what these various sciences are doing. And that's what's been lacking previously, especially within historicism. So on the one hand, the positivists want to reduce all science to natural science. There's no difference between history and biology or physics. And Dilthey is opposed to that. But at the same time, he says, well, there has to be some kind of structure of scientific inquiry that is shared between a discipline like history and, say, the study of society or politics or economics and so on. So what this means then is that we need to expand history beyond the narrative and intuition that we find in Ranke to what he calls explanation. So again, this might surprise some of you who just hear a little bit about Dilthey, because Dilthey is very famous as a defender of interpretation, right? But what is forgotten is that he's also a defender of explanation at the same time. He creates this famous distinction between understanding and explanation, but not to get rid of explanation, but he thinks both are necessary for any human scientific inquiry into the human world, into the historical world. So explanation is as necessary to history as is interpretation. They're both components of it. And likewise, explanation can involve a variety of other forms of the human sciences. So the historian can rely on kind of historical psychology, the anthropology of human nature, the political economy of economic systems, and so on. So this means that history has to integrate the insights of the other human sciences. And what allows this to occur is this new kind of epistemology that he has called a critique of historical reason. So what this does then, right, is establish the autonomy of the human sciences as distinct from the natural sciences. So what then happens to history as a form of human science? Well, it's going to have different dimensions in addition to those described in the historical school. So Dilthey doesn't get rid of the insights of the historical school. At the end, I'll say how he still retains some of them. But at the same time, he wants to extend beyond them, and especially on these three fronts. So for example, he wants there to be a conceptual dimension to history that the historicists denied. This is the role of conceptual analysis, of looking at conceptual presuppositions, not just of the objects of study, but of one's own methodology. So this means that the historian has to become self-reflective. And this is a very important notion in Dilthey. He calls it Selbstbesinnung, which means self-reflective in a very deep way about oneself and one's preconditions. So one has to look at all of these presuppositions then to analyze them, to get clear about them. Secondly, history is not just about individual actions and figures, historical figures and so on. It's not just about Napoleon marching around or things like that. But rather, history is about analyzing the structures that shape individual actions and individual events. So it's very interesting that what Dilthey is doing here is introducing another component of modern history. So history in the past was seen as just a narration about great figures and their activities. So from ancient Greece to early modern Europe, history was basically the history of saints, of sinners, of heroes, of generals, of leaders, of kings, and so on. It was narrative. But Dilthey introduces, and this is very revolutionary, that history is not just a narrative about the past, it analyzes the structures that shape the past. So there has to be this analytic, structural component of historical analysis for him. And this, of course, requires for him the full scope of all the human sciences, anthropology, psychology, and so on. And finally, he says the historian is always interpretive. So we want to get at explanation, historical explanations, right, through structures and functions and so on. But the historian also has to recognize what Heidegger would call their hermeneutical situation, that they're always in an interpretive location in relationship to the past and their own present. So the political interests of today will shape how we look at the political interests of the past, for example. We're always within a certain interpretive positionality in relationship to past, present, and our expectations about the future. So this is kind of the hermeneutical transformation of the notion of historicity, which in Ranke is not yet really hermeneutical. Ranke takes historicity as a fact, but Dilthey turns it into a hermeneutical principle, and this is what makes 20th century hermeneutics and Heidegger, Gadamer, Ricoeur possible to a certain extent. So let's now turn to his new conception of history and the human sciences in this Introduction to the Human Sciences of 1883. What is his alternative that he's trying to develop to both historicism on the one hand and positivism on the other hand? Well, basically he wants to base history in all the human sciences on what he calls a critique of historical reason, but also in what he calls a philosophy of experience. But it's important to understand what these two terms mean. So the critique of historical reason points us to looking at the role of conceptual knowledge in the human sciences, that it's not simply an art. It's not simply intuition, right? But what the historian and what the human scientist is trying to do is gain knowledge, conceptual knowledge of social historical realities. So there has to be this role for conceptual work in history and the other human sciences. And secondly, what he calls a philosophy experience is in contrast to the reductive notion of experience that he considers positivism and empiricism to maintain. So the positivistic notion of experience is just the outer experience of external objects, basically, and the physical material world. And Dilthey argues that that notion of experience is too reductive, too limited, that we need a broader conception of what experience is. And this points the way towards phenomenology and hermeneutics and the other great philosophical movements of the 20th century that try to show that experience is much broader than what a positivist or empiricist might think it to be. So experience then has to be this unprejudiced empirical inquiry as distinct from the dogmatism of the empiricists. So it's very interesting that Dilthey is in many ways very close to empiricism, but he thinks empiricism is too narrow, too limited in how it conceives what experience is. Because there's not just experience of natural objects and colors and so on, there are what he calls spiritual experiences, aesthetic experiences, historical ones, and so on that have to be taken into consideration as well. Well, how then does history function as a human science? Well, we've seen him critique the limitations of thinking of history as an art, but even though he critiques the limitations of history as art, he still recognized that there is an artistic dimension to history, especially in writing history for broader audiences, right? There's this kind of narrative presentation that has to be genial, that has to connect with the historical period, but also to the interests of the readers in the present. And it's interesting that one of the great 20th century hermeneutical thinkers, Paul Ricoeur, is really focused on the issue of narrative, including the narrative in history as well. So there's kind of a precursor here in what Dilthey is thinking in this situation. So history is an art, right? It has an artistic element, just like any science does, because it involves cultivating a practice. But it's also a science at the same time because it's an art aiming at a theoretical body of knowledge. So it's the art of cultivating a theoretical body of knowledge about a particular object, namely historical life. So that's the structure of history. But there's another thing that we have to attend to, is that this structure is self-reflexive because we are part of that historical life that we are studying. And that's kind of our hermeneutical positionality in relationship to history, is that we are always part of the history we want to study. And that point becomes very important for Heidegger, Gadamer, Ricoeur in the 20th century. But likewise, history is not simply interpretive, hermeneutical, it's also explanatory. It also explains causes, structures, functions, and so on, as we're going to see. So let me briefly describe that, and then I'll reach some conclusions about what Dilthey was doing. So history is both an art and a science, right? It's an art because it relies on the imagination. So all the sciences rely on the imagination. Each science has its own form of imagination that it employs. Because a form of scientific imagination in history or physics, whatever science it might be, is a cultivated kind of seeing and intuiting of that subject matter. So we have to study that subject matter, right? But we're studying it as human beings who rely on our imagination, our sensibility, and so on and so forth. And this is true even for the most positivistic natural scientists, right? They still have dreams, they still have hopes and aspirations. They still have to get up in the morning and brush their teeth, right? They still have to be a human being in the midst of their theorizing about the basic particle functions and waves that govern the galaxy and the universe, right? And so on. So the scientist is also a human being. They also are artistic to a certain extent. So this artistry means seeing, visualizing, right, wholes from the parts that are given to us. So this is still necessary in any form of scientific activity. The scientist is given a series of facts, but they have to grasp what those facts mean in relationship to each other. The historian reads all of these facts about the Renaissance in Italy, and they have to figure out what it all means in relationship to each other. So you can't eliminate the role of the imagination from history. So this side of the historical school survives in Dilthey's new conception. But at the same time, he thinks that we can't say history is only about imagination, right? Then there's no difference between being a historian and being a poet. In some cases, there is no difference, but for some of us, we want there to be a difference. So in that case, we want to have a kind of conceptual, objectified knowledge that can be verified to a certain extent. So this is the notion of history as an academic discipline, as a science, that's concerned with theoretically informed knowledge about historical reality. And so both of these are necessary. And of course, they have their own unique autonomous object of study, historical life. That's why we need history. That's why it's justified. And we have to take account of our hermeneutical positionality at the same time. So we see art, science, and basically hermeneutics here, right? That's the threefold structure of looking at a human science for Dilthey. So likewise, there's a role for explanation as well as understanding in history as well as the other human sciences. Some people think Dilthey is only for interpretation, get rid of explanation. That's actually not true. Rather, history encompasses both. History can generate theoretically informed explanation, right? So usually the examples he gives are the use of statistics, for example. We can look at the statistics of poverty in London in the 1850s and generate conclusions, right, about what it is like to be poor in 1850s London. That's an example he gives. Likewise, we can rely on structural functional analysis. We can look at how the political economy structures, say, a political situation. We can look at how the state affects a historical situation. So there are all these structures that are in place. The structure of the state that he describes as the external organization of society, the function of political economy, the function of culture as well. So there are all these different roles that we play in historical life. So the individual is not just one individual, they have a multiplicity of roles that they play. So you might be a sister or a brother, a son or a daughter, a husband or a wife. You're playing all of those roles within the family. But you also might be a teacher or a government employee or so on and so forth. So the same person might have multiple roles. They can have maybe 15 roles if they join many associations, right? Maybe they're active politically in sports and art and music, like some Renaissance person, right? Then they have all of these different roles that help make up who they are, but they cannot be defined by any one given role. So our roles are related to the structures in which we are embedded. And that's why the structural functional analysis is very important for Dilthey's analysis. Sorry. He's not just a interpretive romantic, we might say. There's this role for conceptual, structural analysis, thank you, at the same time. So the kind of analysis that he usually offers is structural functional explanations. And it's interesting because they play a very important role in our thinking of the human sciences, and Durkheim, for example, who's much more of a positivistic thinker, but still uses structural functional explanation. Or you might think of Max Weber later in sociology, or even systems theory and things like this. So Dilthey is kind of a pioneer for this model of the human sciences at a very early date. But likewise, at the same time, he says history is not just about theoretical explanations, right, of structures. It also wants to get at the motivations and meanings that history had for the individuals who live it. This is what he calls historicity. Part of our historicity is what we actually experience in a given historical situation. We might call it our internal perspective. And this is the hermeneutic situation that we have. Our interpretive situation is how we interpret our own historical being in the present moment in relationship to the past, the structures of the present, and our anticipations about the future. So this hermeneutic dimension is described by Dilthey in terms of description and interpretation. So for example, one of the things Dilthey was most criticized for during his lifetime was the idea that psychology is an interpretive human science. Because all the positivists said, no, psychology is a science of explanation, right? Based in biology, physiology, and so on and so forth. But this notion of an interpretive psychology actually plays a very important or significant role in 20th century phenomenology, hermeneutics, and even the human sciences themselves, right? When they want to get at a first-person point of view to look at a phenomenon. So how does the person experience it? That's what he's asking there. So there's also this dimension of interpretive understanding that is kind of the purpose of the human sciences. We offer these explanations in order to interpret and understand our historical life. So this is further developed in his later work, The Formation of the Historical World, which is much more fully hermeneutical. And that's the point of departure for Dilthey's 20th century readers like Heidegger, Gadamer, and Ricoeur. So let's reach some conclusions now. So we're almost over. Are we okay for time? Good. I don't want to talk too long. I already talked long, didn't I? So the legacy of the historical school and Dilthey's new conception is this, right? That there has to be a recognized role for imagination and ingenuity in the life and the studies of the historian. So he states here, history was an art for us because there, as in the imagination of the artist, the universal is intuited in the particular and is not yet separated from it by abstraction and expressed directly, which first occurs in theory. So that's the continuing legacy of historicism in his theory of the human sciences. Likewise, in addition to arguing for the necessity of the imagination, which we see him critique in positivistic historians such as Schlosser, we also have to recognize the role of feeling and sensibility for the historian. This we see in the feeling of value, right? There's no historical understanding without a feeling of value of what is important. Likewise, there's a feeling for what is unique, a sense for interconnections among ideas and facts and so on. So sensibility, feeling, imagination, all of the affective side is really important for history and for the human sciences. You cannot be a good historian without having some sensibility for what you're studying. So there is that dimension of historical imagination that is necessary for good history to occur. And that's how he retains this insight of the historical school, even while he wants to go beyond it at the same time. So here's the answer to that initial question I had. I promised I would answer it. Oh, sorry. I promised I would answer it. That basically he does accentuate the roles of imagination, singularity, and historicity, now reinterpreted as historical positionality. So to that extent, I think Dilthey is not inconsistent in stating at the beginning of the introduction to the human sciences that he's both defending or justifying the historical school, because all of these still have a role in history and in the human sciences. But at the same time, he's also reconciling the historical school with positivism by providing a new theoretical paradigm that encompasses the insights of both. both of historical imagination on the one hand and of historical explanation on the other hand at the same time. So I think to this extent, he's not inconsistent for saying he's justifying the program of the historical school, but also transcending it by putting it in this much broader philosophical context. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Nelson, for that very enlightening talk. Following the connection between history and philosophy that the professor discussed in his lecture, for this afternoon we'll have two discussants, one from history and one from philosophy. For history, we'll hear from Professor Charita de los Reyes, and for philosophy from Sir Vlad Bumatay. After the two discussants, perhaps some brief responses from Professor Nelson, if any. And then hopefully, if time allows, maybe we can entertain some questions from the audience. So we'll hear from philosophy first. May I call on Sir Vlad Bumatay for the first reaction.
Thank you for that very illuminating lecture, Professor. This afternoon, Professor Nelson traced Willem Dilthey's complex relationship with his interpretation and critique of the ideas and methods of German historicism espoused by the great historians of what has been called the historical school. In this brief rejoinder, I aim to locate or map Professor Nelson's discussion of Dilthey's thought in the context of larger issues in debates in the epistemology, metaphysics, and ethics of science. Issues in debates where Dilthey's thought is least appreciated, despite arguably having made profound and indeed original contributions. As a matter of fact, this afternoon I would even go further and argue that Dilthey seemed to me to have anticipated some modern positions with regards to these issues in debates, but while having done so, he should not be viewed to have settled them, or at least not without some lengthy argumentation. Locating Dilthey in this broad nexus of issues and debates in philosophy, I think, is one way for us to understand and better appreciate his contributions in the history of thought. Professor Nelson's discussion of how Dilthey's critique of historical reason emerged as a distinct position from the historicist particularity of the German historical school and the positivist abstraction or totalizing speculation of earlier schools influenced by the likes of Auguste Comte and Hegel, in my view, excellently places Dilthey as an important figure in the context of the perennial issue about the objectivity of science, where objective science is to be operationalized ontologically and epistemologically. That is, as an activity that consists in formulating some epistemologically objective set of propositions, i.e. propositions, the truth value of which is independent from the inquirer, about some ontologically objective domain of investigation, that is, domain of objects that exist independently from the inquirer. This two-pronged ideal of objective science appears to have been propounded by the German historical school, especially Ranke, who conceived history as concerned with past as the past, that is to be discovered through empirical sources that are contemporaneous with this past. The Kantian in Dilthey, in contrast, seemed to have opposed this ideal in his critique of historical reason by arguing for the autonomy of the human sciences, claiming that conceptualization, something which is radically human, is indispensable in the historian's task to work out the connections and relations between and among these singular events. What is remarkable with Dilthey's position, as discussed by Professor Nelson, is not that he veered away from this two-pronged ideal of objective science at all, but that he highlighted important considerations that seem to show that this ideal is not an achievable ideal, at least not for the kind of beings that we are. These are considerations that are being paid serious attention only recently by philosophers of science. Dilthey's remarks about the indispensability of conceptualization, for instance, is reminiscent of the claim from historians and sociologists of science like Thomas Kuhn and David Bloor about the theory-ladenness of observation, i.e. the claim that observation of some event as an event in the domain of investigation is already colored by the conceptual apparatuses of the observer. That is, we do not approach the tribunal of experience empty-handed. This remark is taken by many to have nailed the coffin of the search for the logic of science. But we now know that this has already been pointed out by Dilthey long before there is even a historical turn in the philosophy of science. But more importantly, while Dilthey certainly forwards a particular position about it, his critique of historical reason points to the importance of examining the problem of concept formation itself in settling the issue about the objectivity of science. How are scientific concepts, and concepts in general, formed? Are concepts, to appropriate Kant, mere representations of the starry skies above, or are they also, in some sense, perceptions of the moral law within? Of course, Carl Gustav Hempel and Rudolf Carnap have both written on the problem of concept formation in the sciences in the service of sustaining the distinction between theoretical language and observational language. But we've seen that the importance of this problem has already been recognized by Dilthey, albeit arriving at an opposite result from that of Hempel and Carnap. Aside from this epistemological issue about the objectivity of science, Professor Nelson's discussion of Dilthey's thought also effectively places Dilthey as an important voice in the contentious issue about the fundamental ontology of the world, i.e., the issue about what things should be included in the complete catalog of the things that exist, as Quine metaphorically puts it. Now, this claim would appear implausible to many, as the general consensus is that Dilthey's hermeneutics is heavily epistemological in orientation, while Heidegger and Gadamer are ontology freaks. But it seems to me that this prima facie air of implausibility is extinguished once we consider the attention given by Dilthey to the importance of explanation in the sciences. The demand that the results of the sciences, i.e. physical theories, social theories, historical narratives, anthropological accounts, etc., should yield not only a description of what and how the world is, but also an explanation of why the world turned out to be the way that it is, rather than another, is actually predicated on the recognition of the existence of some structures and powers, for example, causal processes, causal powers, dispositional properties, functions, etc., in the world over and above singular events that we perceive to transpire before us, and of the fact that it is these structures and powers that led to this singular event and other similar events to occur, such that the task of explaining amounts to the task of relating the occurrence of a singular event to some structures and powers productive of that event. Such are causal explanations in the natural sciences, like physics or chemistry, or functional explanations in the social sciences, like in anthropology or sociology. This is opposed to the demand that the sciences need only describe, as it were, the flow of events in the world, which certainly is based on deflationary positions that argue either for the non-existence of such structures and powers, or for us to remain agnostic, even skeptical about the existence of such structures and powers. Professor Nelson's discussion of Dilthey's reorientation of the method of the historical school through the recognition of the need for theoretical explanation, in my view, is not just a mere epistemological reorientation, but also an ontological one. The historical school, represented by Ranke, seem to me to subscribe to the Humean qua-deflationary position that views that the world as the mere collection of events that, while exhibiting some patterns or regularities, are unconnected or unrelated, such that the only legitimate task of history and the human sciences is to recover the regularity of events in the past. In fact, Hume was also a historian who wrote a book on the history of Scotland, and surely he was as Rankian as Ranke would ever be. Again, it is perhaps the Kantian in Delphi that led him to have a more robust conception of the task of history as an explanatory science, and a more robust conception of the ontology of the world, including as part of its furniture some structures and powers, the discovery of which constitutes the task of explanation. This ontological position in metaphysics that recognizes the existence of structures and powers in the world is now widely known as the position of realism about structures and powers, defended by the likes of David Lewis and Theodore Sider. Of course, whether Delphi's subscription to the importance of explanation, which I think commits him to the existence of structures and powers in the world, runs counter to his hermeneutics that emphasizes the complexity and plurality of the life world, not the totalization or absolutization of it under some one principle, is up for some discussion. Lastly, Professor Nelson's discussion of Delphi's late hermeneutics suggests that Delphi has something to say about the issue of the value neutrality of scientific inquiry. Briefly, the issue of the value neutrality of science has something to do with whether it is ontologically and epistemologically possible to bracket our values and virtues and stand sub specie eternitatis, or from the point of view of eternity, and whether and to what extent are these values and virtues, moral, political, aesthetic, productive in the conduct of scientific inquiry. Delphi's late hermeneutics seems to me to constitute a negative answer to the first issue, while an affirmative answer to the second. That is, that the concept of a presuppositionless and valueless science is ontologically and epistemologically impossible, and that it is undesirable. Of course, there are modern positions that argue for the same conclusion. Talk of the feminist standpoint of epistemology, virtue epistemology, the feminist philosophy of science in practice, etc., etc. But it can be argued that what distinguishes Delphi to them is the fact that, while these modern positions only subsume the sciences under the category of propositional knowing, Delphi puts forth the importance of understanding as an aim of the sciences, specifically the human sciences. That the sciences and the human sciences specifically, insofar as it aims at understanding the world and not merely knowing it, should exist within and not outside the nexus of this complex interface of values, norms, and meaning. This to me is a powerful position, especially because it can be argued that it allows for the flourishing of what Sally Haslanger has referred to as the ameliorative task of science and of philosophy. The ameliorative task is different from the descriptive task and normative task typically demanded on science and philosophy, as it concerns neither the mere description of the state of affairs in the world, nor the prescription of norms to change it, but involves the invention of new concepts or the improvement of our old ones, as these needs to invent new concepts and improve old ones will only naturally emerge out of the desire to capture these complex and plural lived experience through new and improved concepts. Thank you very much.
First and foremost, please allow me to congratulate Dr. Eric Nelson for his enriching presentation. And in fact, it's a very good challenge to how history writing in UP Baguio could be rethought. And also, the style I will be using will mostly be in question form, and some clarificatory statements about some key points that Wilhelm Dilthey himself have used in all his writings. When Dilthey said, I am an historical being, the first condition for the possibility of historical science lies in the fact that I am myself an historical being, that the one who studies history is the same one who makes it. I find these lines significant in our meaning-making endeavors as we become living actors or actresses in making history and philosophy and even the social sciences still relevant in the 21st century. In fact, I have seen how the work of Dilthey could even benefit the GE courses that we have, our liberal education in the UP system. This talk, as Dilthey has provided, much inspiration and affirmation of our being at par or comparability with the so-called hard sciences. Now, the idea of history is itself a bequeathed idea, and an appreciation of its importance to philosophical understanding seems to necessitate historical perspective on the way it has developed. The best way to start is with the philosophy of history of Dilthey, dubbed as the pioneer of the human sciences using Rickman's perspective and the philosopher of the human studies. Dilthey, however, has a very fragmentary historical heritage, which I am happy that our dear Dr. Nelson was able to put together in order to come up with such a very nice presentation. His works were translated from German and published posthumously. In fact, there is no single work that contains his thought. His philosophical ideas are spread over several works for which all this knowledge have come about. And thank you that we're looking forward to the book that Dr. Eric Nelson will publish anytime soon, or has it been published? No? So it has been published. So we look forward to that, so we will be able to at least see how these fragmentary sources have unified all these discussions. A historian of ideas and a pioneer in intellectual biography, Dilthey occupies a kind of watershed point, or in history we say a turning point, a nodal point, a conjuncture in modern philosophy and history. He laid the groundwork for the development of many 20th century philosophical trends, which view the scientific method as inadequate or irrelevant in the face of moral or existential problems. The following arguments, issues, simplistic they may be, or humble they may be, I wish to put forward for clarification. 1. When Dilthey distinguished two sciences in his essay embodied in the Introduction to the Human Sciences, may I quote, "What is contained in the concept of science is generally divided into two subdivisions. One is designated by the name natural science, while for the other, there is, curiously enough, no generally accepted designation. I shall follow those thinkers who refer to the second half of the globus intellectualis by the term Geist des Wissenschaften." I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing it erroneously. Which I just spoke with Sir Vlad over there, no? Says it's sciences of the spirit. But when I looked at an additional note, which our lecturer has Professor Nelson has mentioned as John Stuart Mill's system of logic, which Dilthey also used, when we say spirit, sciences of the spirit, das Geisteswissenschaften, no? It simply means moral sciences. So where did these human sciences as a term emerge? No? Was it simply a phrase coined by people who reinterpreted Dilthey's work? aside from this, perhaps I might extend beyond the term human sciences, but we also have social sciences, which is we are using in the university that I am in. In one of the universities in Baguio, they use College of Human Sciences. We also have College of Behavioral Sciences and also Social Studies. So I guess social studies is very much American in orientation, social science, British, human sci, German. Oh, I don't know, no? But these I'm really wondering about because he never talked about any human science. So how did that come about in his work? Second, in the presenter's statement, may I quote, "It is still a disputed question whether, one, Dilthey is primarily making the historical school philosophical or presenting a middle position that will end the conflicts between historicist particularity and positivist abstraction." My inquiry is, should we consider Dilthey's theory of history somewhat ambiguous and ambivalent at one point or the other? Isn't this perceived vacillation perhaps a result of the several interpretations and reinterpretations of his work? What circumstances could have led him to alter his previous stance on human science, historical methodology, contextualization, and historical understanding? At one point, which was also mentioned by Sir Vlad, no, I see also a vacillation. Well, this was not touched no, in the presentation, but I see this ambivalence, let's say, in his stand regarding Kant. At one point, he was Kantian, and another point, he was anti-Kant. At another point, I see him as empiricist, at another point, historicist. In fact, I even read an article which says he was one of the fathers of historicism, and even to that, which will eventually lead to historical relativism. At one point, he comes up with a universalizing tendency and at the same time, a particularizing stance. Third, there are also key concepts of Dilthey's thought which needs further clarification. And I find it very interesting because sometimes we ignore it or we gloss over it because we think it's just an attempt to assimilate someone's thought. For instance, his concept of Weltanschauung, or worldview, which for me has impinged much in our studies of the liberal education and the general education program in the university. So for me, I see the general work no, as a full expression that has impinged on the object of a liberal education which has broadened one's appreciation for the possibilities of human existence by assimilating the life experience of worldview implicit in the great works of human history. Now, another concept which I guess needs clarification, but I guess it's just another term or concept mentioned by Professor, historical consciousness. Historical consciousness is quite difficult to grasp, perhaps because of the assumptions made about history. So the term historical consciousness signifies more than the emergence of an essentially historical orientation within the methodology of present-day humanistic disciplines. It points to an understanding of reality, to a conviction that historical understanding and historical categories constitute the widest possible framework for knowledge of the real. A third concept is lived experience, Erlebnis. I hope I'm pronouncing it right again. So this lived experience seemed to be a very elusive idea, which in retrospect can suggest the unconscious of psychoanalytical theory. It can also push the mind to the brink, no, where Heidegger's neologisms begin to seem necessary. No? So another would be well, of course, hermeneutics. But I'm just curious as to how different or similar is Dilthey's hermeneutics to that of Schleiermacher's theory of hermeneutics. Did he totally adopt it, or does he have his own version of hermeneutics? Also writing at the turn of the century, Dilthey was indeed one of the first thinkers to see the result of historical scholarship. Its insight into man as a creature of history threatened to undermine the very ideal of objectivity upon which historical scholarship itself is based, is one of the very nice thing that the Rankian tradition, a way to challenge the Rankian tradition. Yet, another thing about, while I was just listening, no, some challenges I also want to inquire. No? So for instance, how would grounded theorizing, for instance, affect or influence Dilthey's theory of history, or the other way around? Second, what about the resurgence of the narrative turn in history, where works, for instance, of Homer, Thucydides, etc., are now being republished, reprinted, because they see the beauty of stories, myths, legends. Also, the employment of oral history as a methodology, aside from the archives, which was propounded by historians of the 19th century. Also, what about the linguistic turn to history? Does it have something to do with conceptual structures that the professor mentioned earlier? Or the philosophy in language, which our university, our colleagues in philosophy would like to resurrect as a new course offering. So I see its beauty in this kind of intellectualization that we have in the university. Now, on a positive note, many of Dilthey's ideas are embodied in the very notion of a liberal arts education, which I mentioned earlier, which shaped most, in fact, American universities during much of the 20th century. Now, he also laid the groundwork for the distinction between the sciences and the humanities, and the desire to accord the humanities a status comparable to that of the hard sciences. By the way, before I forget, sir, what about its a challenge to literary history, which is interesting as well, while recognizing the need for different methods in each. Dilthey sought, above all, to formulate a way in which human studies could achieve the universal validity and rock-solid foundation provided to the physical sciences by the scientific method. So thank you very much. And thank you, sir.
So thank you very much for all the comments and questions. I don't think I'll be able to address them all, but I'll try to answer them a little bit. So I'm very sympathetic to both of your approaches. So first off, on the issues of objectivity and value neutrality, I think Dilthey is actually very relevant today to our current situation. So for a long time, the philosophy of science and scientific thinking was dominated by positivism. But beginning in the 60s, and especially now, there's been a breakup of this positivist paradigm. And I think that makes someone like Dilthey much more interesting now. So between 1900 and 1970, it would be very hard for a thinker like Dilthey to have any presence in discussions about the sciences, given their viewpoint about what science is, its objectivity, its theoretical character. So that it wouldn't allow for room for something like historicality, for historical understanding, for interpretation to play a role. But now that we have a more dynamic understanding of the sciences and how they function, I think Dilthey is again relevant again. And he's very, it's very interesting to think about him in relationship to social epistemology, the social understanding of the sciences, and so on and so forth. So I think there's definitely a lot we can do with that. And also on the issue of value neutrality, Max Weber, of course, argued for the value neutrality of the sciences, and Weber adopted some Diltheyan notions like understanding and interpretation, but at the same time was very critical of Dilthey. And on one of those issues was the issue of value neutrality, because for Dilthey, science is itself a value that must be chosen or decided for. Science is not value neutral in the sense that it's not just given to us, and its practices are not just given to us, but rather we have to practice it, we have to cultivate it, we have to affirm it to a certain extent. So to that extent, science is never purely value-free, either as a object because we have to value it to do it, and also in terms of its own structures, it appeals to values and norms in a variety of ways. So even the most natural scientific sciences like physics have their normative dimensions in terms of how they cultivate and educate scientists, but also in theory building itself. So I think for Dilthey, we might make a distinction between the role of the imagination, the artistry of scientists such as Einstein on the one hand, and then the conclusions that they reach, they have to be verifiable by other scientists at the same time. So I think in that way, there's a way of reconciling non-value neutrality with the idea of objectivity, while recognizing that a complete objectivity is never possible at the same time. And so this also raises this issue of the relativity of truth. So sometimes Dilthey has been criticized as being relativistic in his implications. So for example, Husserl had a very early critique, early for Husserl, not for Dilthey, he was dead then, of his thoughts, right? In the Logos essay where he says, well, Dilthey's kind of historicism leads to relativism. But I think in Dilthey's own understanding, the conditionality of things does not suggest that we endorse a relativism where every view is equal to every other view, because we can still use concepts and criticism and reflection to evaluate and assess concepts. So in that sense, there's no one absolute truth, but not having one absolute truth doesn't mean that anything is possible or anything is permissible. So in that sense, Dilthey provides a kind of historical reason for why we should not be historical relativists. And that's something I tried to draw out today as well. So I'll now get to some of the individual questions. And it's interesting that Dilthey is actually very important for pedagogy in Germany. So he's kind of compared to John Dewey sometimes. John Dewey was an American philosopher who did a philosophy of education, and Dilthey was much earlier, but had a similar role in thinking about education in the German context. And so the questions, let's turn to these. The one about the natural human sciences and why we call it the human sciences is actually a very interesting one. Human sciences is basically the current English translation for Geisteswissenschaften, but the origin of the word Geisteswissenschaften is not Hegelian spirit as such, like a philosophy of spirit in Hegel's sense, but rather, as you mentioned, it's actually a translation of Mill's term moral sciences. So the expression moral sciences, practical philosophy, were translated with the word Geist in the German context. And so the Germans developed the Geisteswissenschaften idea in relationship to the moral sciences, but then they expanded it at the same time. So there's a transition then from what in Hume's time, for example, was called practical philosophy. So for example, Adam Smith was a professor of practical philosophy, not of theoretical philosophy. But with the development of the human sciences, there was a debate about how these sciences should be termed: social sciences, human sciences, behavioral sciences, and so on. And they all imply different philosophical presuppositions about what kind of sciences they are. Behavior sciences, they concern kind of a presupposition of behaviorism, for example. Social sciences have a certain idea of social structures. Human sciences presuppose a human being of a certain kind. Geisteswissenschaften presuppose a certain notion of what spirit is as a historical, moral reality, and so on. And that's why Dilthey states that all of these words are not really appropriate, but the best one he thinks is the Geisteswissenschaften. If we understand Geist not as pure spirit in a religious sense, but in the German historicist sense of the living reality that we experience and lived experiences and understanding and so on. So I'll try to go through some of the other points more quickly so I could spend a long time trying to address all the questions you have. But basically, for the issue of 1 and 2 about whether Dilthey is simply defending historicism or mediating historicism and positivism, I think he's doing both at the same time. And so the conclusion of my paper tries to resolve that ambiguity, right? It says these two things are not incompatible with one another. One can defend something or justify something by including it in a larger context. So of course, a pure historical school historicist would not recognize that. But on the other hand, he retains the inside of it, right, while including it in a broader context. So I think that's a way of resolving that problem. At least that's what I argued. And likewise, in relationship to Kant, we have to recognize that it's not so much an ambiguity, but he's relying on while transforming these thinkers. So Dilthey is very much, in many ways, as you mentioned, a transitional figure, right? And that's why he's kind of confusing, because he seems quasi-Kantian, quasi-early Heideggerian. He's somewhere in between these figures, right? So we can look at Dilthey in terms of Kant, or looking forward towards the early Heidegger in the 1920s. So it's a question of our interpretive lens as well. But basically, he's radicalizing the Kantian project of critique. So critique becomes a kind of historical self-reflection on our living sense of ourself, rather than on an abstract, transcendental ego. So there's this radical transformation of Kantian epistemology going on, but at the same time, he's still indebted to the language of Kantian transcendental philosophy and German idealism, even while he's transforming them and breaking them and making new avenues of inquiry possible. And so in that sense, he's underappreciated, because he belongs halfway to the old, halfway to the new. So he's not quite as clear-cut as either Kant is or Heidegger is, right? But I think that makes him actually more interesting in many ways for being a bridge-like figure in that way. So he's radicalizing Kant beyond Kant, we might say. And that's why there's an ambiguity about whether he's a neo-Kantian. He's not in the neo-Kantian schools. So he's not a Kantian in that sense, that are focused on epistemology and reviving Kant's epistemology in relationship to the natural sciences primarily. But you can say he's neo-Kantian in a much broader sense of Kantianism. And I think that's why he's actually was in a contest against the figures of neo-Kantianism. They were all critics of his thinking, and he was a critic of their thinking. So he's not a neo-Kantian in the narrow sense of the word. And then this issue of worldview is really big as well. It's hard to get into that in much detail here, but basically for Dilthey, the worldview is an expression of a world, historical world, a context of life, and it's supposed to get at not just our conceptual thinking, but at our preconceptual presuppositions about what the world is like, how a world hangs together for us as social historical agents. And also for Dilthey, there's not just one worldview for any given society or individual, there are multiple worldviews, and they come into conflict with each other as well. So in his later thinking, he has this whole account of the conflict of worldviews that also plays an important role in 20th century continental philosophy. Then you also raise the issue of historical consciousness, which is a really important one, so I can't go into much detail, of course. But basically that refers to our both our unconscious, but also, as you mentioned, but our conscious reflections on our own historicity. So historical consciousness means not only that you have consciousness of a history as an object, that, say, Caesar existed in the Roman past, right? But rather you have a consciousness of your own historicity, that you are a historical being. So historical consciousness means that consciousness recognizes itself as fundamentally historical. And that's something that Heidegger adopts, although he gets rid of the word consciousness, right? He says Dasein is historical. And that's basically his way of reinterpreting what Dilthey means when he says consciousness is intrinsically historical. It belongs to historicity. So it's reflexively historical, and because it's reflexively historical, it can become part of our self-reflection as well. And then Dilthey has this structure of lived experience, expression, understanding that I didn't talk about today. And he really develops that in his later project, his later account of the human sciences. And that's a very important structure that he has in mind as well. But basically the notion of Leibniz is trying to expand the notion of experience beyond the empiricist and positivist notion of experience. So for the tradition of empiricism and positivism, history is simply, experience is simply a collection of atomistic sensations for the most part, at the most basic level. We have sensations of shape, of color, sound, and so on and so forth, and we put these experiences together. So it's primarily oriented towards external objects, but also it can be internal in Hume and other figures as well, but still it's primarily atomistic. And Dilthey argues that our experiences are holistic. Our experiences are textured by the context in which they occur. They interconnect as wholes. And that way, Dilthey prefigures Gestalt psychology, phenomenology of Husserl and Heidegger, Merleau-Ponty, and so on. And basically, that's what he means by a lived experience. It means the totality of an experience. All of the different facets that it has, both, that's not just composed of atoms that are externally put together, but it has an internal structure. And so part of his psychology, I mentioned, has this interpretive, hermeneutical side, but also has this structural side as well. And the structural side is holistic in a way that very much prefigures early 20th century German thinking about this. And so, yes, so lived experience gets expressed in a variety of ways in our behaviors and our objectifications in social life, our products and so on. And these are things that we can understand. We understand the other's lived experience through their expressions. You see their face, their gesture, you hear their words, you read their writings or whatever it might be, and through that you interpret, right, what their lived experience is. And so finally, this issue of hermeneutics is a very interesting one because Heidegger and Gadamer both critique the limited notion of hermeneutics in Dilthey. And Dilthey's hermeneutics is limited. He uses it just to talk about philology. So Schleiermacher and Dilthey are hermeneutical thinkers, but they don't use the word hermeneutics to describe the structures of consciousness or of experience or anything like that, but they use the model of hermeneutics to interpret them. So they're implicitly universal hermeneuticists, right? But they're not explicit ones. So for them, hermeneutics is the study of texts and expressions, various expressions of human life. But then they use that as a model for understanding the sciences, philosophy, and so on. And so in that sense, Heidegger and Gadamer are right that the notion of hermeneutics is limited, but they're already using that model to understand all of the human sciences, the human world, and even philosophy itself. So in that sense, there is an implicit universality involved in their hermeneutical thinking, even though it's not called hermeneutics yet. So I think that's important because that's a matter of controversy with between Dilthey and Gadamer scholars, for example. So likewise, this relationship between history and theory is an important one. And I think actually he's very close to the historical school in proceeding from the particular to the general. It's not quite inductive, but it's quasi-inductive, you might say, going from particularities of history to general theories about it. But once we have a theory in place, then we use those theories to interpret those particulars. So there's a kind of, as you mentioned, theory-ladenness that the historical school didn't really recognize. So there is a kind of inductive side, but then on the other hand, there's a concept formation which shapes how we interpret and understand historical particularities. So I think Dilthey is much more aware, as you mentioned, of the kind of contextuality of our interpretations, that you don't have a pure particularity, but you don't have a pure universal either, but they're always in this hermeneutical relationship and tension with one another. So that's an important part of his understanding of the relation of history and theorizing. And I think insofar that he's still sympathetic to elements of the historical school, and he himself practices them as a historian. So some of his most popular works in history are about the history of the great German poets like Goethe, Hölderlin, Novalis, right? So he's still doing narrative history in this kind of historical school fashion, but he's drawing on certain conceptual analysis at the same time. So I think to that extent, he would very much be favorable towards the recent narrative turn. Because he never wanted to eliminate narrative from history, but he just said there needs to be narrative and these structural kinds of explanation in history. History needs both. And likewise, oral history is interesting. I think there was already a sense of oral history with the brothers Grimm, for example. So Jakob and his brother, they went around Germany collecting the stories of various people in the countryside, of peasants and so on, listening to these stories of what we call fairy tales and so on, the myths of the popular German people, the ordinary German people. Then they wrote them down and then generated kind of analyses of the German mentality and things like that from them. So I think there is already kind of a sense of oral history in some of the German historians of that time. Insofar that they're collecting fairy tales, for example. That would be an example of that. Then, of course, you collect the oral history, then you write it down, then it becomes a written document, then part of the written history. And so in terms of the linguistic turn, that's another question, right? That's very difficult to answer briefly. But I think he'd be sympathetic to any kind of structural analysis in the human sciences, as long as it doesn't replace the human side of it as well. So even if there's a structural linguistic analysis of some phenomenon or another, there still has to be this other dimension of particularity, imagination, and so on. So I think you can give a Diltheyan kind of response to the questions you raise. It might be very complicated, and also the issues you raise as well. You can probably develop something, although you need much more time to do that adequately. So sorry, I just wanted to give a brief kind of indication of what I might say more fully, possibly someday, in response to all those great points that you had. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Sir Vlad, Ma'am Chat, and Professor for that very interesting response. I think we're now ready to entertain just one question because we're short of time. If you have other questions, I think you can also approach the professor. So yeah, yeah. If you have questions, if you can just please introduce yourself, approach the mic in front, and give us your question. Going once? Yes, Chancellor.
I'll make my attendance relevant. Yeah, thank you, Dr. Nelson. Dilthey is my favorite philosopher of history, so I really
wonderful. Good to hear.
sat down to listen to it. Maybe just to further clarify, and you did a very clear presentation of Dilthey. I understand him better now.
Oh, okay.
But
Good
I
to
think
hear.
for the purposes, for the sake of the students, I'm asking this because we have to explain why historical imagination? Because it's not just imagination for imagination's sake.
Right,
As mentioned by Vlad earlier, I
Right.
think we have to understand the ontology behind this.
Right.
Dilthey's acknowledgement that the nature of the thing that we're studying
Right.
in the human sciences is subjectivity and intersubjectivity.
Right.
And the power of empathy is important.
Yes,
We understand the past and make sense of it because of the power of empathy,
Right.
something that human beings possess.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's a great point. I didn't emphasize it as much today, so I brought in the historical imagination a little bit at the end just to show how he retains this dimension of the historical school in his philosophical thinking and his philosophical project. But both of you are right that it's not just imagination that's going on, like a psychological imagination of the story that he's describing, but it's in the context of maybe what we might call an ontology of the historical world. He's developing an ontology of historical life. That means what are the kinds of beings and that are being encountered in the historical world. So in the historical world, we don't just have atoms in motion, right? We have living, subjectively thinking, feeling, willing human beings. We encounter all sorts of social structures of the government, of economy, the state, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot going on in the human world that requires us to have a use of our imagination, but also empathy and looking at other people. But also it implies a certain kind of ontological status of these objects as well, that they have a certain kind of reality for him. So it's very interesting that Dilthey was a critic of like the collectivist kind of thinking that was going on in Germany at the time. So many people in German social historical thought said that something like a people is a real entity. It's a real organism. That the German people are an organism just like, say, a wolf or an individual human being. And that's something that Dilthey actually rejects. He thinks there are no like superorganisms like that. So he's a critic of a certain kind of organicism that's going on in German thinking at the time, but he still wants to be able to recognize social, historically formed realities that have a certain structural, functional role within that historical life. So for example, the state is not an organism for him, but it does have a structure in place that we feel in a variety of ways through taxation or the police force or whatever it might be. So it has a presence through all of those institutions and practices through which we experience it. So in that sense, the ontology of the social historical world is also tied to our experiences of it, of course, but then it requires a certain kind of structural analysis to go deeper than our experiences to realize what the nature of the state is or what the nature of the economy is, and so on. So imagination and empathy are like half of that analysis for him, that allows us to see the wholes, to connect things together, and empathy allows us to appreciate what other people are experiencing and going through. And that too is part of the historian's task, is to see into the other person to a certain extent, insofar that they can through their expressions. Then at the same time, we want to arrive at a certain kind of knowledge about others as well, through history and the social sciences. So it's very interesting how Dilthey is bringing these two different elements together, both this more subjectivistic side, emphasized by the historical school, but also in a in a kind of transformed way, the objective side emphasized by positivism. But he doesn't simply take over positivism, right, because he reinterprets what concept formation, what concepts do in the human sciences. And he thinks they have a different function there than they do in the natural sciences. Namely, they're functional, structural ones, right? So thank you very much for that question. Thank you much for attending. So thanks, everyone. Hope to see you tomorrow.
So that concludes our program, everyone. May we invite you once more to the professor's second lecture tomorrow. That one is on Bloch and Levinas. Thank you for attending, and good afternoon.